and it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham-Pars incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer really standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Please remember to visit the website podcastufo.com for past episodes, blogs, and forums. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. And Alejandro will not be with us today. He'll be back next week. However, if you want to check out openminds.tv, next week, myself, Lee Spiegel, and he will be talking about the 2017 year in review. It's always an interesting and fun show. So our guest this evening will be John Alexander. He has written a book called Reality Denied, Firsthand Experiences with Things That Can't Happen But Did. Real interesting book. I've been reading it. And he's also going to be talking a little bit about the secret Pentagon UFO search. So if you support the show, I want to thank you very much. And if you can't support the show but want to listen to the full shows, you can either watch on YouTube, you can watch it live as well on podcastufo.com every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or on the Dark Matter Digital Network. That's Thursdays. You can listen to it as a podcast for the full 2 hours, starting at 10 to midnight. That's EST. All right, so hang in there. We'll be right back after this quick music break with John Alexander.
They were showing some of the videos. There's some more stuff that has yet to come out, and convince them that it was, in fact, real. But a lot of it was on his personal recognizance.
I didn't realize that. I had Chris on the show way back when, and we didn't really, it's funny, we didn't talk, he talked about some different UFO things, but never mentioned things like the Nimitz or anything like that, or any future plans. He was on, I believe, in July of 2016.
Well, I know most of the players that have watched this evolve, albeit from distance, and there was a lot that they did keep pretty close to the vest, and they wanted to make the maximum use where it would get the attention that the story certainly deserved.
Right. And have you been contacted by what happened in your life when this actually was published? Did you get contacted by a lot of different people about this?
Not so much, but mine. I wrote a book that came out in 2011, and what Alessandro did was very much parallel to something I had done 30 years before. He was more successful than I was, to the point that he was actually able to get funding. But I had dealt at the etheric levels within the Department of Defense and the intelligence community, and a lot of our findings, by the way, are very much, particularly critical issues, are very much the same. Specifically, nobody's in charge.
Wow.
See, that runs counter to the whole UFO community thinking, oh, we're orchestrating the release of information, there's going to be dribs and drabs. Reality is that it's very personality dependent. You got to have somebody who's willing to pick up the guidon and, carry it forward and be willing to risk your reputation and career off it. Because some of the things you were discussing there, and why don't people come forward? Well, particularly within the military, as within the aviation community, reporting UFOs is not what we call career enhancing. You can get your wrist slapped for it, not because you're saying anything wrong, it's just a risk of embarrassment.
Right.
Institutional embarrassment.
Yeah, I imagine so. Now, you actually looked into, you tried to find some type of connection with the government researching UFOs several years ago, and you came up empty-handed, right? You couldn't really see anything going on, but this was prior to the 2005 or whenever that was initiated.
No, I retired in '88.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I did run a similar program from about 82 or 83 until 88. It was not funded, but we had representatives from all of the services, many of the branches of the intelligence community, as well as the aerospace industry. Everybody had top secret and SCI level clearances, and we were exchanging information. But the bottom line was everybody says, well, I thought you were doing it, passing the buck to somebody else. And when you got to the very highest levels, well, I tell the story of an individual who was the head of one of those three-letter agencies who would have to be, as an institution, would have to be involved, if you believe these stories. And his comment was, we don't do that. There are no requirements for us to do this. But conversely, I'll tell you about the ones I saw. So here was an individual at very high levels who had previously had an experience of seeing UFOs, so they did not have any trouble with existence, but was saying institutionally, not our responsibility. And generally, I would agree with that.
But what about, the thing that comes up a lot is, what about the aspect of that something is flying around in our skies, and, protecting, like, say, the United States itself? There's something that's non-controllable flying around in our skies. And, isn't that a security risk? Shouldn't that be taken seriously? Well,
years ago, I would agree with that. And when I wrote the book, this is the earlier book, we're here to talk about reality denied, but in the UFOs, myths, conspiracies, and realities, I addressed that and I said there's two issues. One was the one you're mentioning, was the is this a potential threat? And almost anything that you can't identify that's interacting, particularly with our nuclear systems, could fall into that realm. And the other, of course, was particularly with civil aviation. There have been a number of cases with near misses out there, and certainly very credible pilot sightings. So I thought those were the areas. Now, part of that is to get funding, and I do know that they have been criticized by many in the UFO community, and particularly in the experiencer community, for discussing a threat. In my view, one of the things you've got to do is understand, and by the way, most people haven't the foggiest idea how the government really works. Some of your best-known people who have reported on government interactions say you ought to take a decade off, find out how the system really works, and then come back and start writing again. But the point is, the Department of Defense, their mission is to defend the United States against threats. So if you're going to try and get funding, you're going to have to couch it in terms of a threat, which they did. Again, the UFO experiencer community, if I can kind of broadly categorize that, many of them feel that they have a friendly relationship or it's very positive and it's not a threat. If we might digress, and I can address Condon because that's, a study that was not well understood. If you see my briefings, I said Condon was right. Because the question to Condon was not, are UFOs real? It was, are UFOs a threat? Because they were dealing with the Defense Department. And so the issue of threat, and I say he's right because as far as I know, we haven't had certainly a hostile invasion, and we can discuss whether or not ET is here. That's, I think, a different issue, but
right.
I don't want to have a monologue. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, as far as the government goes, do you think that they are going to talk more freely about this since this thing was published and the Pentagon admitted that this was happening?
Back when I was working in what we called the building, I used to run around looking for this guy, Pentagon, because it says the Pentagon says this and the Pentagon says that, and the Pentagon doesn't say anything. It's a big stone building that's occupied by a few tens of thousands of people, all of whom come with their own personal beliefs on it. So the short answer to your question is probably not. Yes, there will be a few individuals who feel, a willingness to come forward and talk about events or explore the possibilities. Institutionally, the Department of Defense is very conservative, and I mean that in a variety of ways, but risk aversion is a high priority.
Now, I know... Go ahead.
Anything that will embarrass us.
Yeah. I know... I think if there were probably, more threats or there was some type of threat... right now, for the most part, there are a few stories, I don't know if they're exactly true or not, where, a plane crashed and, a few different things happened. But if they felt there was a threat, do you think it would be like a total different story, or do you think they'd still conceal it as much as possible?
Where the community does not understand. Let's take the Nimitz case, for instance.
Okay.
Interaction over 2 weeks, certainly exciting, high-quality data. That was 13 years ago, or 14 now, I guess.
Yeah.
The point is that we tend to look at all of these instances and pile them up and say, wow, look at all of these things happening. When you amortize that over an entire globe and for at least 70 years, they get to be relatively rare events. From an institutional perspective, if you're a manager and you're allocated X amount of resources, how much money are you willing to put into discovering, an answer that you have a very low probability of resolving?
Exactly. Yeah, that's been something that a number of people have talked about over the years. The resolve and part of this is just, something that is eluding, and, who's going to put money into that. Now, as far as the money that was invested, the $22 million, some people have scoffed about that. I think, that's a very, very small portion of money, actually, when it comes to the Defense Department.
We're not even talking lunch money.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Remember, that's $22 million over 5 years. That's
right. Now, I know that you worked, your book starts out, you're talking about you worked for NIDS. You were hired by Bob Bigelow, interesting guy. And, hey, by the way, is it true that you spent the first night at the Skinwalker Ranch alone?
When Bob bought it, yeah.
Yeah, when Bob bought it?
Yep.
What was that like?
A lot of mosquitoes, actually. You must know. We had no buildings at the time, and I was up on top of the ridge overlooking things. And, the initial was wind and mosquitoes.
Wow.
Came in. No mystical events, but those did seem to follow. Many people know Eric Davis, who seemed to have much more of a personal attraction or affinity for some of the more bizarre incidents that occurred. Yeah,
I'm interested in reading your book. I want to talk a little bit later about how things seem to follow certain people. That I find really fascinating as well. As far as Bob Bigelow goes, there is a story about him having some metals, some type of metals. Have you heard anything about that in particular?
Well, we actually, when NIDS was active, had certain materials that were sent in and researched. And what you're reading on the paper is the same as what I see, is that some very interesting material, none of it's unobtainium, meaning something that can be, disproven to be from, the Earth or the galaxy, rather than some very interesting engineering that may have taken place to create that.
So, in other words, it's all of some type of elements that are known?
Yeah, all of them known. Now, I would say, I'm not sure who did the analysis. I know it's been attributed to the study, but I know in NIDS, the actual participants in NID, full-time employees, did not do it. This was farmed out to other universities and metallurgical laboratories for analysis. And my guess is that's the approach that you would use if you had it. But we have known, when you go back to, again, the study that I was running in the 80s, material was known to exist at that time.
Really? Wow. I never realized that. I thought this was actually something fairly new that they were talking about.
Maybe new pieces, but the existence of material and droppings and that is definitely not new. It goes back many decades.
How about that? Wow. Never knew that. So,
and provenance is one of the key issues in all of that. What's the chain of custody and reliability that the site of origin can be positively determined?
I see. Now, going back to this, the Nimitz case and the footage that's out there, as far as this being classified and then obviously unclassified because they're talking about it, do you find that interesting? Do you think that's kind of unusual that they declassify something like the footage and let the naval officer, the pilot, talk about?
No, the critical issues, I don't think, with the declassification was the incident itself, as opposed to the capabilities of the sensors. The key issue from a DoD perspective is we call sources and methods, and what you don't want an adversary to do too soon is to be able to figure out exactly what your capabilities are, not so much for UFOs, but for, threat detection in other sectors.
Really? Okay. All right, hang on just 1 second here, just adjusting something here. But the naval pilot, when he publicly comes out and discusses this, do you think that it's scripted? Do you think he has to stay to certain guidelines, or do you think he's free to talk about it?
Sure.
Wow.
Again, if there's anything that's sensitive, and this would be similar to, satellites do pick up UFOs as well, not widely talked about, but has been acknowledged in some areas. And the issue in general, particularly from the DoD sensors of satellites, is how good are they? How good is that sensor system? Again, because you don't want to tip your hand to North Korea specifically, China, Russia, other agencies. You'd prefer them not to know just how good your systems are. And those were the issues that were more protected, not that you picked up some weird object flying around.
I see. I saw some type of, I don't know if it was a tweet or something like that out there, that there is, they're saying that there's more coming out. Now, I don't know if this has to...
I do know that they have more in hand.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And let me ask you, I don't know if you're comfortable talking about this, but what did you think at first when, Tom DeLonge came along and said, he had some really, spectacular announcement to make?
I'm not sure what the question is.
Tom DeLonge, were you following that when he was saying that he was working with the government and had an announcement to make?
I've read the books. We have spoken once on the phone. I have not met him. But again, the others, admittedly, several of them are close friends. So there has been some discussion of watching through the evolution of the announcement.
I see. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, there's some questions that came in here, and let's see. Carrie wanted to know, do you think that the Pentagon video shows black project technology that is being tested against its own military as an unknown craft?
Yeah, I keep getting that.
Mm-hmm.
I'll rephrase that. No.
The one
I
reason...
keep getting that question, and you just don't do that. We got a place. If you want to know what happens at Area 51, that's exactly the kind of capabilities they do test out there.
Right, of course, yeah. But I have heard a number of people say that they think that it's possible that it's, Russian or some type of foreign technology. But the one thing
that ought to scare the crap out of everybody to even propose that, because that infers that they have made a huge technological leap. That would definitely shake up the Pentagon. Not sure they'd be talking about it, but it would be a major effort.
Well, not only that, the thing that I have said at least a couple of times is that, then they're forgetting everything that's happened, over the last several decades, and that have been observed, very, similar crafts, similar technology has been observed.
Well, no. Again, if you get back to the briefings that I gave 30 years ago, the capabilities, the aerodynamic capabilities that are being described currently, all have been present for 70 years. And we know damn well, we did not have that kind of capability at that time. I think in general, there are some people that I would take to task who have been making wild claims You can find it on their internet. That we've had interstellar travel capability. We're just hiding it for some reason that I don't fully understand. But I totally reject that notion. So there are a few people who make those kind of claims, but it's absolutely not true.
Yeah. Kind of like the bases on the backside of the moon and all that type of stuff along those same lines.
That's really what well, I've got, again, slides that I use that there are no lower limits. I don't care how crazy a scenario you can come up with, even demonstrably false, and yet you'll find a subset of the people who believe it. I think they all live on Facebook.
Yeah, well, that's what you get. It's a changed world with the internet, and I do get a lot of email too, so I know what you're talking about. And you have to stop the engagement sometime with some people that kind of go out there a little bit.
Well, there's a critical issue I think is worth discussing, and that is if we have some of the capabilities that they're describing, that we have little widgets that fly around is totally insignificant compared to that means we have a unique understanding of some previously unknown energy system. If you had that, no matter what you're talking about, zero-point energy, anti-gravity, etc., that changes the total geopolitical situation of the world. We can make the Middle East irrelevant. In fact, in one of my earlier books, I actually address that as a way to get out of, conflicts. So the notion that, we're hiding an energy source of that magnitude is just preposterous.
Yeah, along those same lines, I've heard many people say that they think the triangles that everyone is seeing these days, that also have the capability of acting weightless and moving without obvious propulsion and all that. A lot of them, there's a lot of people that are steadfast saying that that's definitely, some type of government technology.
The answer to that is Dave Marlowe's book on triangles, meaning those craft have been reported since the 1800s.
Right.
So,
exactly. Yeah.
Before Kitty Hawk.
Right.
So,
right.
No.
And I had someone on the show that I just know through what I do for work that actually came on the show just for a few minutes to talk about a triangle that was over her car when she was young. That was just hovering over and then took off and never made a sound. This was back in 1970, I think she said 77. So yeah, if that technology was around, I don't think we'd be not using it and hiding it this long, especially.
We have now been at war for entering the 17th year. We have spent upwards, certainly over $2 trillion, if not $3 trillion. And during conflict, you do see some advances in technology, but probably the best things we've seen are the F-35, which is certainly not a gravitational or anti-gravity system. There are some better sensor systems, and we've done a great deal of work in prosthetics, which will bleed over into the civilian sector as well. You do not see, any of these big leaps, and I know the conspiracy crowd says, well, they're saving it, at $2 trillion and 17 years, you're saving it for what?
Right. For someone to try to wrap their head around what a trillion, just 1 trillion is, if someone were to count to 1 trillion, they'd have to live 30,000 years.
Good analysis.
Yep. I mean, it takes that long. And yeah, as far as though, like Skunk Works, Do you think they do have some, pretty unique things that, they always say that, or I've heard a number of people say that, we're seeing what's 20 years, behind only. Do you think that's a kind of an accurate statement?
20 years is probably not too bad. I point out that Ben Rich was a friend of mine who was the second president after Kelly Johnson. And we discussed this, and I know this runs contrary to some of the statements out there, but he specifically had a shopping list. Said, if UFOs, I want the propulsion system, I want the cloaking, et cetera, et cetera. And no indication that they had it. They do. I used to work, my last job on active duty was Director of Advanced System Concepts for what was then the Army's Laboratory Command, meaning very, very high-tech, but very early stage. And our estimate, and it's remained fairly constant, that from the time of discovery until implementation, 15 years is kind of a minimum.
Wow, isn't that something?
Yeah, this notion, see, this gets into the energy issues, because we have looked at that, and a number of us who are interested in these areas say, if you have an energy breakthrough of the magnitude we're discussing, it will take you at least 2 to 3 decades to inculcate that. It takes that long before you, again, if I have a pound of unobtainium that I hand to you, and it can get you 1,000 miles in your car, it does you no good, because you do not have an engine system or a way to, get that to drive the engine, to drive the train, to make the car move, etc. The infrastructure required to adapt the new energy system is tremendous, and takes, look how long solar panels have been around, if you want a good example, or windmills for forever, and yet we're just starting to see those as viable renewable energy sources.
Right. Wow. So let me just read off another question from Carrie. Can you give any information about the aviary group? And if you were a member? That's something I'm not familiar with.
Oh, well, this is, Bill, I'm blanking on the name, but Jamie Sandera and whatnot. This goes back decades. My take is the aviary, as conceived of in conspiracy theory, simply doesn't exist. I was given a bird name, but it was because they were,
okay. Yeah.
What they wanted to do was to be able to talk about people on the phone, much like we're doing now, and so they would assign individuals basically code names. Bad news is, I got one up near, we're at near Wright-Patterson, and several of us were there, and they gave out name. I can't remember which is mine versus, which go to other people. But there was never a group that got together to conspire to do anything, as far as I know.
Okay, all right. Now, did that? Wasn't there something to do with Paul Benowitz and Richard Doty and all that when it came to like the aviary names? Am I getting that confused?
Well, those things all get mixed around. My position has been, if the Benowitz case is true, as has been purported, there's some people who ought to be in jail. Yes,
I know. Just terrible. And, and I've followed what Richard Doty has said lately on a few different shows, and I've been actually quite shocked with what he says about seeing aliens and things like that. I don't know if you've seen any of that.
I do not follow that, no.
Yeah, it's rather shocking. So let's. I'm just seeing if there's any questions in the chat room right now for you. But as far as the Pentagon, I just wanted to kind of close out that, and then we can talk more about, we'll talk about your book and things that you experienced. But do you think if more videos come out, do you think the news will pay as much attention, or do you think that the news media will just kind of die down even if more information comes out?
That will vary tremendously depending on, what they are. Just more videos, and from what I understand, they are not as good a quality as has been released already. But I think it's going to be seen as more of the same. Will some agencies pick up on it and do something? Yes. Of course, the UFO community, Alejandro will have a ball. Open minds and all of that. But as far as New York Times, they'll probably do a couple of articles or something. But unless there is some blockbuster, and I have not heard of anything like that, it's just more evidence of what we already know. Right.
I was glad that they did come out. And I think it was important that they came out with a good quality video first, when releasing this as part of the story the way they did. And I know that there has been a few people trying to debunk the video itself. Have you heard of anything about that? Have you heard other people say that?
I think that's nonsense. Yeah. First of all, the video in and of itself is interesting, no doubt. But as I'm sure you discussed with Chris, you got to remember there were 3 different radar systems that were involved, as well as the physical observation by pilots. Over 2 weeks, there were a lot more people than that involved. So, in my view, it's the consensus that's being reached by multiple. I also saw people come out and say, well, this is just a flare or a mistake in the video. You haven't got 3 radars, plus the video, plus eyewitness testimony. That's not all being made up. And my point has always been that, the multi-sensor convergence has been what's really key in understanding the reality of the phenomena. And support to eyewitness testimony is terrible, understand all that. But when it's corroborated, as you have here with multiple systems, then I've had, we were doing a show with George Knapp the other day, and a guy came on and said, well, I wouldn't believe it unless, and you go, when you have all of this stuff lines up, the answer is it is real.
Right. And what was the guy saying in particular, that he wouldn't believe it unless it was right there in front of him or something like that?
Yeah, basically, he was using the oft-quoted Carl Sagan, extraordinary claims that require extraordinary evidence. Well, yeah, the extraordinary evidence already exists. By the way, there is one key factor I would like to bring up that might change the discussion a bit. Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting that the Department of Defense is interested and did do studies, and they do have access to sensor systems that are not generally available. But this is not a defense issue, nor should it be. This is something that should be in the public domain because there's far more people having credible experiences that have nothing to do with the Department of Defense. Excuse me. It's a global phenomena that has been around for millennia. So if you're going to try to get some resolution, you've got to get civilian scientists involved.
And to the one thing you said earlier, it's a non-solvable issue. And I think that's, besides the possible ridicule factor, of course, that would be alleviated if it was...
No, I did not say non-solvable.
Okay.
What I said is that you have low probability of solving it, and particularly when you have a small amount of resources. One of my quotes is, we are looking at a phenomena, or phenomena plural, that is at least as complex as AIDS or cancer. And if you treat it like that, and then you say, okay, well, what are the resources that are being applied towards that? I mean, they're minuscule. You know, the cancer, we put in billions and billions of dollars and made certain advances, but it's taken, you know, phenomenal amount of time, effort, and resources in order to, you know, get to where we are. I also have an agenda, which I freely put forward every time I get a chance, and that is, I think, we need to make it so that serious scientists can get involved in the study of all of the phenomena. We ought to broaden out into some of those, but without risking their reputation, livelihood, or career.
I agree. Totally agree with that. And there is as the different things that you experienced in your book, there seems like there's some type of underlying situation where there's some type of commonality or something going on with a lot of these different things.
Well, that is the thesis. The book is reality denied, firsthand experience with things that can't happen but did. And as I've discussed in most of the seminars and whatnot that we've talked to people, is that there is, in my view, a common factor. I have a early slide I use in most briefings, and it shows, there's UFOs, but we also talk about near-death experience, psychokinesis, post-mortem communication, spontaneous healing events, firewalking. They've been involved in all of those, and even cryptozoology. And in my personal view is that they are all connected, and that consciousness is a piece of that.
Wow. That's really fascinating. And there's a question that came in actually from Lee, and it might be just because of the way the calls may not be able to come in tonight with a technical issue. So Lee Spiegel wants to know, why do people still hope for UFO disclosure when many feel disclosure has already happened? Do you think that there's already been disclosure?
Yeah, that's been one of the themes in the various UFO presentations I've given. And the point is, you have been told over and over and over again, UFOs are real. So what do you mean by disclosure? If it's the reality of the phenomena, I mean, it's been from presidents, there's been, high-ranking people, Gorbachev, some of the former Soviet Union cases are exciting. Again, global phenomena, high-level people, all saying it's real. How many times do you have to be told we think it's real before, it takes? In this recent article I was quoted in, and I told the author, I said, what I disagreed with, they say the government has been denying the reality of UFOs. That's just not true. They've said we're not interested in general, but as far as denying reality, if you go back to the infamous Twining memo from 1947, and it specifically states this is a real phenomenon. It is not an illusion. Take it seriously. So if reality is the issue, now there's others who say disclosure wants to mean ET is here, and for many people walking among us, that's another step. But there are, in fact, there was a Roper poll done a number of years ago that said they estimated 20% of the global population believe that ET is physically present.
Wow. I would have no idea. that it was that. Does that mean as visiting in UFOs, or do you mean actually feet on the ground?
I think most of them think that means walking around.
Wow. Wow, wasn't that something?
Remember, we have people probably that we both know who say, I met E.T.
Right.
You know, I have problems with that. My response, because I have addressed that in the presentations as well, is that if that is true, not for our benefit, because he certainly has not helped with health, poverty, wars, climate. I mean, pick your macro issue going on in the world today, and have not seen E.T. step in to save us.
You know, but there are cases like, for instance, the Ariel School is very convincing to me. Alejandro and I were talking about that earlier. And in that case, and a few others, you know, I think people really have experienced, I don't know, I can't say 100% that they're aliens, but they're something that wasn't from here.
Yep.
And I think
I do. The second chapter of my book has to do with Chris Bledsoe.
Right, yeah.
This is kind of a dramatic case. I think a lot of people are familiar with him now, but I was physically down there. What convinced me of the reality was that my wife Victoria and I and Chris and his daughter Emily had gone down to the Cape Fear River where the incident first began, and he was explaining how everything occurred, and it was late afternoon. By the time we got back up to the car, it was dark. Victoria and Emily got in the car. Chris and I were leaning against the left front fender, and he's pointing out various locations where things had happened. And all of a sudden, he goes, "Oh, I think they're here." And within about 10 seconds, this thing pops into view above us and went zipping off. Don't know what it was, but it certainly fits the reality of a UFO. But the point was the temporal relationship between him saying, "I think they're here," and the incident occurring. And as you know, that case goes on. One of the major things was that the following day, there's a lot of intervening material here, if you can read the chapter or get the case. But about noon the next day, he realized he had not taken his medicine. And the point was he had Crohn's disease, which is a very socially debilitating illness. And since that time, and what had happened, he'd had an encounter with the ET who had said, "Oh, we're here to help you." And after 12 years, never took another dose of medicine.
Really amazing. Now, I know, you mentioned the fact that in your book, you mentioned the fact that Chris has taken a lot of heat from the UFO community, along with other people. And so I was kind of curious how you got involved with checking it out, with that in mind, checking out what was going on with Chris.
I had a sponsor in that case who was interested, who knew Chris and was helping him, and facilitated me going down there and spending the time with him. An amazing family, by the way. And they have coalesced predominantly because of the nastiness of the, quote, UFO community. I've got to say, in reality, the incidents that he described are pretty hard to believe.
Yes.
But like my response was having had a personal experience with it, that's the piece that got my attention. There's other aspects to the story, including a tree. He's got a pretty big backyard, and there's a tree in there that had caught fire internally. And I watched certain things occur around that for me personally, hard to deny. Another aspect of it is he periodically gets both still and videos of orbs that appear, sometimes in the visual spectrum, sometimes not until actually filmed. But this was certainly not a one-time event, and it kind of still continues.
I know. I met Chris a few years ago. He was up here in Maine at a conference, and I got to sit and talk with him for a while. Real nice gentleman. Really enjoyed talking to him, and he seemed very authentic to me. But you're right. His story is really bizarre, and I remember when I first read about it, I was thinking, wow, this is like, it seemed almost impossible. But, the more things like this have, since you have seen actually this happen, I just think it lends a little more credibility, and maybe people should really take a look at it.
When you get this independent verification, means a lot.
And the tree, did you say in your book that people are claiming that has some type of healing powers, or am I thinking of something else? Yeah. Yeah,
no. A lot of people do think it has a healing power, and they would actually send articles of clothing to him, and he would put it in there and then return them, or people would come out and visit and leave articles there for a while and have them returned to patients. I don't know of any studies that validate specific healings, but again, I personally saw some things that took place there that has certainly convinced me that something is going on.
I remember someone telling a story about a dog and something really strange happened there. Did you ever hear?
You're talking about Ray Hernandez.
Oh, okay. When Ray was there?
No, this happened down at his house. I saw Ray just about a month ago. I was down at his house in Miami, and he and his wife were describing the case. This is one where they had a very old dog that was physically on his last legs, and he came down and he was able to show me all of the location. He's written this up extensively, but came downstairs and his wife and the dog disappear, and we're truncating the story dramatically. Instead of being concerned, and he does not explain why or how and cannot, he goes back up and goes back to bed, and, comes down later, wife and dog is there, and the dog is acting like a puppy, totally cured, and they were just about to have the dog euthanized and live for another year.
Amazing. So, with this book, Reality Denied, this is like, you've had an amazing life. How many continents have you gone to? How many countries have you visited?
There's two different questions. As I say, we've been to all 8 continents. Until just over a year ago, I know they thought there were only 7, and New Zealandia has been added to that. And have been on all of them, and I don't know, I guess we're approaching 100 countries.
My God, wow. That's amazing. So I know there was another question Lee wanted me to ask you, and that is, and like I said, I may not be able to take calls, so the question was something along the lines where you have done all these amazing things, and has anything actually scared you?
I talked to Lee earlier today, so I was expecting that one. And my response is, anybody who says they have not been afraid is, at some point, is fooling themselves. My response to him was not because of interactions with creepy crawlers or something like that. I will say the incident that I think really got my concern up was we were in Israel and in the Jerusalem area, just out the east side of the old city, and that day there had been, this is mid-morning now, but early that morning there had been an attack near Gaza, and the IDF had killed a number of Palestinians. And so the tensions were definitely up. And Victoria and I were by ourselves, meaning no guide or anything, walking around trying to find some things. And she's insisting on going to certain sites, and we had Palestinians in control of saying, you can't do that. And I was hearing talk in the background, and frankly turned to her and said, Victoria, we shouldn't be here. But that was a very physical potential. I think you do need to have your own situational awareness in cases like that, and you can't go blundering along as the ugly American and think that your Americanism is going to protect you there.
Right. Yeah, was in a situation in Russia that scared the heck out of me, and it was, but I survived and got out of it, and and I don't speak Russian, so I felt pretty lucky. So I want to talk about some of the chapters in your book, one of them being voodoo, but before that, I know that you looked into, I didn't get a chance to read your entire book, but I got, partway through it, but I know that you were working or looking into the energy, and I'm trying to figure out which that is. That was the guy in Canada. What's that?
Are you talking about the Hutchison effect?
That's what I'm talking about, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that was most interesting. This was back in the early 80s when I was in the intelligence community. We were presented with a short film that was most remarkable in that it appeared to have items that would levitate. Some of them would accelerate the things that would happen. Just a wide range of issues. For instance, part of the film had a rat tail file that was held between two boards and exposed to this field, and the file heated up. If you're familiar with the old filament in light bulbs, it was like that, but then think of, you're talking a 1/4-inch thick file, and to the point where it burns brightly and then disintegrates and falls down. Two aspects to it. The wood that was holding it was not burned, and the people who were present said they reached in immediately and picked up the items, and they were cold. What happened was John, interesting friend, still in contact, but from a scientific perspective, your worst nightmare, was not educated in the classical sense, and could not control what was going on. But anyway, he had been kicked out of his home. One of the problems was he was using lots of high-power electronics. He had Tesla coils. And one of the things he had done was to look at Nikola Tesla's workshop and look at the bench and try to figure out what items he had and what he was doing. And he would collect all this stuff and just had it going. Well, the problem, this is the old days when television waves went through the air. Yep. And so he was creating kind of an electrical storm in the apartment he was staying in and bleeding over into the neighbors who were quite unhappy. So he had to tear it down, and we had them reconstructed at a site. And there were some things that happened that I'm convinced were real. The problem was that, again, the lack of control, and we had previously agreed upon a specific show and tell, and I brought in a cadre of people from both my organization and from Los Alamos, and absolutely nothing happened while we watched it. But 5 of the 6 people who were there were convinced that some of these things probably did occur. And John continues to do some very innovative research to this day.
He's basically his goal is sort of like along the free energy or something like that, isn't it?
Well, it is known as the Hutchison effect, and people can go on YouTube and that and see various demonstrations of things that have occurred. The saving grace in our case was a guy by the name of George Hathaway, who was an electrical engineer who lived in Toronto, who had taken all measurements of where everything fit, and he also still has a tremendous number of samples of the various materials. I do have, in Reality Denied, I've got, I think, 1 or 2 pictures in there of some of the shattering. For instance, I remember there was a crankshaft. Remember, this guy was totally unfunded, and he got his material literally by going to, junk stores or junk shops and, retrieving items. But he had a crankshaft from a vehicle that had been exposed to it, and then they took it to BC Hydro for analysis, and one end, this is a single piece of metal, right? So one end is case-hardened steel, and the other exposed to this field is soft as lead. And, how you explain those things happening, we have partial deformation of the materials. Hard to say. We never could get it under control, and I turned it over to Jack Houck of the PK Party fame, who was at McDonnell Douglas, also tried to fund some experiments. Again, you just never got it quite harnessed.
Wow. Yeah, I did way back a number of years ago, well, probably 2 or 3 years ago, I did watch a couple of videos that I thought was pretty interesting on YouTube. And speaking of free energy, I know you mentioned before, perhaps our conflicts would be over in the Middle East and things like that if we could figure out some type of energy source. But wouldn't that, it would almost be a situation where it would be a world disaster and then rebuilt upon that in a way?
No slightest.
All right, let me hear what your thoughts are.
Well, again, if you go back, if you have a major energy breakthrough, it takes 2 to 3 decades before you've inculcated this across the world. There would be some changes. Frankly, people say, well, it's going to be suppressed by the energy industry and all that. And I say not at all, because the people who own energy, and we know one of the major problems in the U.S. today is disparity of wealth, and this would potentially make it worse. Others would say, well, no, you can get free energy. You could reduce energy's costs. But whoever owns the stock and the companies now are the same ones who are going to buy the stock and own the infrastructure and whatever comes along. So I don't think it changes. What does change is geostrategically, again, reliance on oil from the Middle East or Venezuela. There would be winners and losers in countries, much as there are now for economies that are dependent primarily on fossil fuels, oil in particular, as the price fluctuates, and I think the price would drop dramatically there, but the availability of energy would change things. But again, it would not be overnight like flipping a switch. It would, the entrepreneurs who got ahead of the power curve would create the companies that, again, disperse the energy, or generate and disperse the energy of the future.
I know there's a lot of people that I've heard a number of people say that everything would be suppressed, like you just mentioned. That's their thoughts of what would happen. And suppressed, any invention would be suppressed.
Nonsense.
Yeah.
That is utter nonsense.
They'd have to know about it first.
Is that they, again, you look at it purely economics, and that's their position, is the oil industry, et cetera. No. Those are owned by people. I imagine the Koch brothers would turn on a dime. Mm-hmm. Just go into the development of those energy sources along with others. Again, the people who can capitalize the restructuring of the infrastructure are the ones who are the long-term beneficiaries, and they're not wedded to oil and recognize that there's significant problems with the reliance on fossil fuels, and particularly this is an extraction industry, which means there is a finite supply of oil. It's big, but it is finite.
Right, absolutely. And I remember when I was in high school, they were saying that there was enough oil for 30 years. They were wrong about that. But still, it is still finite. And, when they get into doing fracking and things like that, it can be a problem. So Uri Geller, I want to talk about him. He did the foreword for your book. I know, Ray Stanford knows him well. He's quite an amazing guy. Getting into the metal bending, that is fascinating. Have you actually witnessed this firsthand?
I guess you didn't read that chapter.
I didn't get to that chapter, no, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I used to teach that. You'll find videos of me describing some of the incidents that happened. Now, this was one of the things in the intelligence community that we got interested in. While Uri is a personal friend, and I've seen some pretty remarkable things occur around him, the big impetus for the change came from, again, Jack Houck, McDonnell Douglas, who created what became known as spoon bending parties, or PKMB. And the short answer to your question is yes, we saw some really amazing incidents, and again, the book describes a variety of them, and in fact, the appendix in the book is a how-to to run your own PK party.
How about that? And how do you, is that explainable in any type of way? How's that done? How can that possibly be done?
I'm not sure what the question is. If you're talking about the procedure to get there, yeah, we understand that. If you're talking about the underlying mechanisms, the answer is no. And some of the big issues are, whether or not energy is deposed or can be conserved. What we did discover, we actually had taken a number of items that appeared to have spontaneous and significant bending, and when you grind them up and look at under the microscope, it looks like heat. And a tremendous amount of heat, but we know that there was no heat present. We also know that, again, using the cutlery example, that there were certain types of extruded and stamped, different ways of forming cutlery, and seems to make a difference. Bob John, who, had the Princeton Paralab, we were at actually in our Naval Research Lab at a meeting discovering these things, and his supposition was that where you're functioning is a more fundamental level than physical, and that's a level of information, i.e., what is it that tells the spoon to be a spoon and holds it in that configuration, and that you basically are perturbating the information structure as opposed to the energy structure. Wow.
And if you're like down to the atomic level, basically, it just changes the
certainly
way.
Molecular.
Wow.
you look at how, the changes that have taken place, and you can see them. I mean, they are discernible at certainly a molecular level.
Uh-huh. There was one more UFO question that was someone wanted to ask you, and that was, with your experience in the UFO field, do you think that we're being visited by nuts and bolts craft or something that we just don't understand?
Yes. I mean,
that's a good answer.
Does not mean that we don't understand. We do not understand nuts and bolts craft either. I do believe that certainly some of the observations in the case are absolutely physical. I think they may be transitory from a temporal perspective. But when, again, in my UFO presentations, I start out with a simple question like, what do you mean? And by that, I'm questioning, well, I've got little balls of light that float around. I have hard craft that are 1 mile, 2 miles across, just absolutely gigantic, and thousands of variations in between. So, tell me again what you mean, Yeah. So, and again, we know, Jacques, the quintessential book on this was that, they have been reported for millennia. I might extrapolate a step further, as the question usually follows, and that has to do with visitations and interactions. And I point out we have had reports of interactions between humans and sentient non-humans throughout the entirety of human history and all cultures. And one of the things that's new is, oh, by the way, they flew in on a little craft of some kind. But these interactions have always been there. Yeah.
When I was speaking with someone about the topic, not on the show, but in a house, or I think it was, they said something along the lines where, there's always been something, but they were talking about it's always been some type of fantasy, like fairies and leprechauns and things like that.
But that fits the bill. And again, if you look into the culture, if you go to Hawaii and spent years out there, the Menehune, so the wee folk or little folks appear again in cultures throughout the world.
All right. Another part of your book that I actually did get to read because it was toward the beginning, and I thought it was really interesting because I've had firsthand experience, actually, and that's healing and healers. And that is a reality of mine that, like I said, I've had it happen firsthand, that I didn't believe it even until it actually happened, and I thought it was ridiculous. I saw you talk about when you fell back and you found yourself.
Well, now, are you the recipient or an observer?
I was a recipient.
Okay.
And I'll just tell my story real quickly. Is I had terrible chronic back pain for about 5 years, and it just every day, every morning, every night, I couldn't sleep. It was terrible, and I was on a plane. I was on a flight, and heading up toward the area where I was living, and I was talking about it, and someone said, well, there's this healer and in a little chapel up in Maine, and you should go. And I'm thinking, so my girlfriend was there, and my girlfriend at the time, she said, let's just go. So anyway, I had an open mind enough to go, and then I'm in this little chapel, and this little tiny woman, about 4 foot something, real small lady, she was really cute. She was doing the rosary, and I'm thinking, let's get out of here. This is ridiculous. And then she asked if anyone needed to be healed, and people would get up, and then she would say a couple things and touch them, and they'd fall back, and I said, that's it, I'm leaving. So my girlfriend said, no, you're not leaving, you're going up there. And I said, we came all the way up here, we spent the day getting here, let's go. So I got up, and the woman asked me what my problem was. I said my back pain, and So she put her hand on my back, and if you gave me $10,000, I couldn't stand up. I fell back, and she didn't even push me. I fell back, and someone caught me, and I was on the floor, and then I never had back pain again. It was gone. So I know, as crazy as that sounds, it happened, and it worked. And I talked to the woman. I ran into her somehow, like a year or two later. She's no longer with us, but I ran into her and I said, "How did you do that?" And she said, "I don't know." She said, "I don't know. I just had, she claims that she almost died one time, and she survived, and ever since that time she was able to do that."
You hear that a lot. If I digress slightly, but I'll come back to it, and that's the near-death experience. And the point is, we can talk about that. As you know, I did my doctorate under Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and so the issue was, we thought initially that NDEs were a discrete event that happened over a very brief period of time. And one of the things that we learned in studying it, and I became the president of IONS, the International Association of Near-Death Studies, for a while. And what we found is that these events tend to continue, and people become precognitive. They become psychokinetic capabilities, and healing kinds of things does seem to follow. Exactly why, I can't give a good reason as to why. All I can say is these events do occur.
Yeah, it to me that was, I remember being on the ground and saying, "What am I?" Kind of like it happened to you. You're saying, "Why were you on the couch or whatever?" How did that happen? And that's kind of how I felt, and it was just really, really amazing. Well,
I have another chapter in the book that's equally amazing, and that is on the crystal skull.
Right. Yeah.
It was very short. Got to see the Mitchell Hedges crystal skull, which is probably a fake. I mean, all the indications are that it probably is a fake, but. Even so, we were there. Again, long story short, had seen this, and like you, I'm standing in front of it. There's a medium there, waves her hand in front of me, and the next thing I know, I have fallen backwards. Now, in my case, there was an individual, a male a little bigger than I was, who was standing there prepared to catch me, and yet I knocked him over, and we both ended up on top of a couch, and you cannot explain how that happened, why it happened, but I remember feeling a slight wave, and I was getting ready to catch myself, and, as I say, next thing I know, I am, waking up on top of this guy who's going, "Alexander, I didn't know you weighed so much." Which I didn't, actually.
I went to the Expo 67 in Montreal, Canada, years after it was still open. You could go visit. I think it was in the 70s at some point I was there. And I remember there was a crystal skull there. I was staring at it, and they said they thought it was ancient. And there are a number of these known around, aren't there?
Yes, there are several, and in fact, in the folklore, there was supposed to be, when 13 were brought together, we were going to have transformation of the world, and all kinds of things that happened. This one was reportedly found in what was then British Honduras, now Belize, by Anna herself. I think it was planted by her fathers, but and supposed to be very, very ancient. But the examination of it pretty much indicated machine tools, maybe in the 40s, and you could follow it. But my point was, even though I'm pretty sure it was now that it was a fake, the incident still happened.
And one of the things, I know one of the chapters I was reading, I think maybe it was back to healing again, was that they tried cotton and things on mice as they weren't influenced by the placebo effect.
Well, you use that on people as well. In my case, my brother had an operation, and we sent him some of the charged cotton, and we had immediate pain relief. And interestingly, you treat it just as if it were, disposable medical item, just like you'd throw away bloody gauze or something like that. So, this was, we'd worked with Bill Bengston of the Bengston Healing Method, and anybody who goes to his website will get redirected to the availability of the cotton, which is prayed over. And seems why I had another friend who has since died, who had throat cancer, and used it and said certainly pain relief. As I say, he eventually crossed over, but thought that he got tremendous relief from using it.
Amazing, just amazing. The one thing chapter I'm going to get to sooner or later because it kind of fascinates me is the voodoo, and I know, voodoo is kind of misused a lot of times. People just think about the doll and you stick pins into it, but there's a lot more to it. Can you talk a little bit?
Well, my point to Americans is everything you think you know about voodoo is wrong.
Uh-huh.
And ours comes from television and movies and whatnot. And now, we were in West Africa at the time, which was the cradle of it. This was where, back in the Dahomey Empire, the Spiritist religions evolved. But it is not just a religion or something you do. It is an entire way of life. Everything they do in voodoo is, it totally integrated, dealing with the spirit world as well. The step that I thought was a bit far, we had a guide who I remained in contact with, and when the Ebola crisis broke out, indicated that he thought that Togo would be spared, and it was, but I'm not sure I want to go so far as to trust voodoo there. But the most interesting, and you'll see the pictures of it in there, what we saw them dealing with fire, standing in it, sitting in it, holding it in their mouth. I've got video taken at very close range, the individuals holding it for, more than a minute, and inhaling and exhaling and seeing it brighten up as the air passes over it. I took it to, I know, key magicians here in Las Vegas. We have lots of them, but this was Jeff McBride, who's a magician's magician, and he trains, the best ones, and had him look at that and just said, nope, that's absolutely real. He showed me some of the tricks that can be applied, but said, no, what they're doing is real. I might mention the people have said, well, they have some magical ointment that they put on to protect themselves. I said, this is a poverty level that looks up to dirt. No, they have not got magical, proper materials that they apply to themselves that protects them from the flame.
In the title of their subtitle, things that can't happen but did. So that's exactly, an incident right there that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's what it defies the laws of thermodynamics. Absolutely.
And, it's the same with, I don't know if there's more to walking on coals than what you're talking about right there. But, how did that, I mean, that's something I would think that someone, going back to we're talking about UFOs and science, it seems like the science community would want to know how that's done. If it's indeed can't be any type of magic trick.
They tend to just ignore it. The premise is it can't be, therefore it isn't, and by the way, I'm not going to be bothered looking. Mm-hmm. So, why waste my time with something I know can't happen?
Yeah, amazing. Which is, it's too bad. And I know, I know you were kind of enamored with Brazil. I remember hearing you talk about that on another show. And why is that?
I've done a lot of work, as I think you know, like you, I live in a couple of different worlds. I have what I call the straight world. Mm-hmm. In this case, where I do national and international, geostrategic implications, created the non-lethal weapons issue, and was done a lot of work with that down in Brazil. Have been down many times. It's just the things that we have seen firsthand. And again, there's whole chapters on that. One, for instance, my wife being totally possessed. So it's one thing to watch other people whom you don't know and you question whether or not this possession is real. But this is a spirit, taking over her physical body and remained so for about 20 minutes. It was a Umbanda ceremony. We do a lot of work with ayahuasca. She's kind of a devotee of that, but Umbanda does not call for any chemical substances. It was just kind of an amazing experience, which again is detailed in Reality Denied.
Was that a scary situation for you, in particular?
No, I wouldn't put it as that. It was interesting. I was taking pictures, and the guy came up to me, and he said, are you a reporter? And I said, no, that's my wife. And then he goes, she'll be okay. Just relax, don't worry about it. And pretty much came to pass as they had described. She went over and sat on the side. Well, they took her aside and did something for a while with the high priest, and then sat on the side. She does not consciously remember any of the things that had taken place. Wow. She's generally relatively shy, and again, in the book, I have a photograph that I took there. We're in an auditorium or a chapel, I guess, about 300 people, about 10 gringos, and they see possession all the time, so that's a norm. What is not a norm is when you see a gringo out there spinning on the floor, not self-consciously or anything, and it literally is a showstopper.
Wow, amazing. So the one thing I talked about briefly is when you were talking about that something seems to be attached to someone, and I know in the I'm talking about the traveling poltergeist chapter you have.
Right.
A lot of times, there's that situation with the house in Connecticut that it was called the most haunted house, and they think it had to do with a young girl that was, going through some emotional times. So can you talk a little bit about that chapter?
Well, the incident here, again, as I say, first-hand experience, this happened to me. I was married at the time to a woman who had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. Boy was the youngest, and we did have the oldest girl was right in the age, puberty, and what we do know from people who studied poltergeist phenomena, a lot of it does occur around that age. And, of course, they're going through a lot of emotional strife. But what was interesting is that we had incidents that happened in Hawaii. Again, I went to the organizational effectiveness school at Fort Ord, so I was there for a number months. While there, we had incidents occur in the apartment. Following that, I was transferred to what was then Fort McPherson in Atlanta, Georgia. And while we were there, we had major incident I described. For instance, standing in the kitchen and hearing a crashing sound in the next room, and a bag of cookies that had been sitting on the table had picked up and flown across the room and, smacked against the wall, and there was absolutely nobody in that room. And we had access to it, so we knew that nobody had slipped in there. But we had items flying around periodically. And again, the question from a scientific perspective is, where does the energy come from that can levitate an object and propel it across the room? And, we're not talking about moving feathers and things. We're talking about, substantial physical items being levitated and propelled.
Right. And it's the same talk about levitated. The part where the bed goes up in the room.
I'm sorry?
There was somewhere I was reading in your book when someone was laying on a bed and the bed rises right up to the ceiling.
Oh, that's a totally different case. That's my brother. That was your brother. Okay. When we were growing up, we were in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and we had it was an old house then, even older now. It's actually a dorm at the moment, or a frat house, and but lived in the. We had our bedrooms in the attic that was partially furnished. And he had the case where he had in there he's just in the bed, and it literally lifted all the way to the ceiling, enough so that he had to put his hands up and left palm prints on the ceiling, pushing it back down. Said when it hit the ground, he was out of there and did not return to the third floor for a couple of weeks.
Yeah. I've always thought, like, if I was in a house where weird things happen, I wouldn't care if I just bought it. I would just leave. I wouldn't want to be around any of that stuff. So, out of everything you
he had other things fly around too, but I mean, this is if you remember The Exorcist, the original one. This is right out of that with a levitating bed.
And it was your cousin that was stricken as a child, right? That got into martial arts?
Yeah, Gary was a 10th Dan Ishan-Ryu, but he and his brother had rheumatic fever and were bedridden for a couple of years. And that's why it was so amazing that, never participated in sports, couldn't even go outside or anything, and then once healed, joined the Marine Corps, and as I said, became known for his athletic prowess.
Right.
1,000 contacts, full contact, or 1,000 matches, full contact, and undefeated.
They don't have full contact anymore either, do they?
I know. He laments that dramatic. We still talk about that.
Yeah, all padded up, as you said in your book here.
Set a record in Madison Square Garden, knocking a guy out in 5 seconds.
Wow, 5 seconds. Amazing.
He hits, and I can say we were in Black Belt magazine together, and I never sparred with him, but I've held, and he kicks really, really hard.
Obviously, right. So, in this whole book, what would you say is the most mind-bending, so to speak, or most unbelievable in all the entire book that you wrote that was the hardest to swallow for you?
I don't know how to address that. And unbelievable, obviously they are believable because by definition these things happen, which is the whole point to the book. That, if you addressed any of the issues specifically, you would say that can't happen. They say, no, but it did. And one of the sayings I use is, anything that does happen can happen.
Do you think it has anything to do with yourself? Have you ever thought of that angle?
Oh, of course. The way I usually address that is it's not so much what happens to me, but things around me, like a catalyst for various kinds of experiences.
Mm-hmm. And has anyone else in your family have an interest in the type of things that you do, or as open-minded? And where did you get this open-mindedness?
Don't know. My brother, Don, who was the one who was in the bed that we mentioned, says, well, I studied the things that happened to them, but that did not transition to, the curiosity that I have. So, and I also get questioned, how did it change? And I said, I don't know. It's kind of the interest has always been there, and any changes have been more like, steering an aircraft carrier than any epiphany or, critical incidents that caused interest in these areas. So.
Wow. So, do you have anything in the future lined up, or are you going to? Do you have anything as far as writing any more books coming up?
Well, I'm working on some things right now, but remember that most of, again, like you, most of my time is spent in what I call the straight world. Right. And so I write on, geopolitical incidents. I do blog periodically on the Huffington Post, mostly on, again, geopolitical issues. The one I'm writing on at the moment is addressing the common factors in football, particularly NFL, but football in general, climate change, gun control, and issues like that. And the short circuit, the common factor is willful ignorance. Our ability to, smoking was the other one, that how the public in general just refuses to accept data, and that's on a macro scale. So where that transitions into what we're talking about is when common interest says these things can't happen and goes against what we haven't discussed is the materialist world versus the spirit world. Our society has the ability to just ignore vast amount of data and act in ways that are not in their own personal best interest.
And why do you suppose that is? I agree with you. And how do you suppose people rationalize things?
I have no idea. There was an interesting book I read a few years ago called The Myth of the Rational Voter. And, of course, the issue is that, in a democracy, and yes, I know we're a republic, but in the democracy where we vote, the assumption is that people will vote in their own best interest and yet repeatedly do not.
Wow.
So emotion trumps logic almost every time.
Really? That is fascinating. I never knew that aspect. I've never heard of that. Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, John,
are you familiar with our current president?
I mentioned our current president last week, and John, I got to tell you, I got so much hate mail, and it was just a very, I thought, kind of a simple phrase.
As I said, emotion trumps logic every time.
So,
pun intended.
Yeah. Okay. John, it's been a real pleasure. And hey, are you going to be out I heard a rumor that you might be out in Arizona coming up at the UFO Congress. Is that true or a possibility?
Well, I don't intend to go down, and Alejandro has said no. So
okay. Well, All right. Well, thanks so much, and it's always been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Okay, thank you.
All right, you take care.
All right, bye.
Bye. All right, everyone. That's it for the show, and thank you so much for being here today, for supporting the show or watching it live on YouTube or on the Dark Matter Digital Network. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And next week, we'll be back with Charles Lemereau. It has to do with a film out on, I believe, UFOs. So that will be our show next week. So thanks again, and remember to keep your eyes to the sky.